Miss Calloway is here to fulfill the partnership condition. Nothing more. That was how Alistair Vane introduced her to his board. Not by name, not by the 23% stake she'd inherited from her father. The man who'd helped build Vane Medical from a 3-person operation in a Portland warehouse into a company with 14 distribution centers and a federal supply contract. Not by her 8 years of emergency medicine or her faculty position at St. Catherine's, or any of the dozen things Brenna might have mentioned if anyone had asked. The partnership condition. She sat 3 seats down from where he'd gestured, not at the head of the table, not across from him, just 3 seats down, next to the company's outside counsel, who smelled like cigarettes and didn't make eye contact. And she put her hands flat on the table, and she looked at Alistair Vane, and she didn't say a word. He didn't notice. He was already moving on to Q3 projections. Brenna didn't cry. She hadn't cried in front of anyone since the day they told her her father's heart attack had been fatal, and she wasn't going to start in a glass-walled conference room with 12 people who didn't know her name. She picked up her pen. She opened the quarterly report in front of her, and she started reading. Later, she would mark that moment, the pen on the page, the numbers running down the first column, as the exact instant everything started. Her father, Gil Calloway, had been the kind of man who kept his own records. 2 sets. The ones he gave the accountant, and the ones he kept in a lockbox in his home office that he'd pressed into Brenna's hands 4 months before he died. Look at these when you feel ready, he'd told her. Or don't. But keep them. She'd kept them. She hadn't felt ready until the day she sat down in that boardroom and realized not one person in it had thought to learn her name before she walked in. Gil and Warren Vane, Alistair's father, dead 3 years now, had built Vane Medical together. Equal partners, different skills. Gil was the systems man, the one who built the procurement architecture and the quality control framework. Warren was the salesman, the face, the deal closer. Together, they'd been formidable. Apart, and Brenna suspected they'd known this, which was why the partnership agreement included the provision that neither heir could exercise full voting rights without the other's formal recognition. They were incomplete. The provision was written in 1994. It was deeply impractical and probably not legally airtight, and Brenna's attorney had told her she had arguments she could raise in court. But that would take 18 months, and Bess's tuition was due, and the emergency medicine attending position paid well, but not enough to also fight a legal battle over something her father had wanted her to have. So she was here. Alistair Vane was 36 years old and looked like a man who had never once in his life been told no by anything he actually wanted. Dark hair, the kind of jaw that photographed well in business profiles, a suit that had been tailored to him specifically. He ran his meetings with the precise efficiency of someone who found inefficiency personally offensive. He interrupted twice during the Q3 presentation to ask questions the presenter clearly hadn't anticipated, and both times he was right to ask them. Brenna noticed this the way she noticed things in the ER, clinically, without attachment. He was sharp. That didn't make the 3 seats down any less pointed. The woman beside him, Gemma, Brenna had learned from the company directory she'd reviewed the night before, was a public relations consultant who had been with Alistair for 2 years. She wore a silk blouse the color of smoke and took notes on a leather-bound pad with a fountain pen. She didn't glance at Brenna once during the 3-hour meeting. Brenna used the time to read through the quarterly report twice. By the time the meeting adjourned, she had 4 pages of questions. She didn't ask them. Not yet. She didn't have enough to ask anything yet. What she had was this: a number in the procurement line items that didn't square with the delivery logs she'd cross-referenced before the meeting. A subsidiary called VH Logistics that appeared twice in the vendor payment ledger, neither time with any corresponding paperwork in the digital archive. And a gut feeling that she'd learned, over 8 years of working in emergency rooms, to treat with considerable respect. She started going to the office. Not every day. She still worked 3 12-hour shifts a week at St. Catherine's, still picked up Bess from her after-school program, still made dinner and read stories about the solar system, and answered questions about why hearts had 4 chambers and not 3. But the days in between, the quiet Tuesday mornings when Bess was in school and Brenna was technically off, she started spending at Vane Medical's Portland office in the corner of the 3rd-floor archive room with a cup of coffee and a legal pad. She requested files through the company's records administrator, vendor contracts, QA sign-off logs, inbound shipping manifests for the past 3 fiscal years. She framed the requests as routine, familiarizing herself with the company's operational structure, and the administrator, a woman named Darlene with bifocals and a quiet indifference to anyone above the rank of director, processed them without comment. Brenna worked the way she'd learned to work overnight shifts in residency, methodically, without the luxury of panic, trusting that pattern recognition would do what brute force couldn't. The pattern, when it emerged, was not subtle. VH Logistics had been paid $2.3 million over 18 months for warehousing services that Brenna could not find any physical record of. The invoices were formatted correctly. The approval signatures were genuine. But the delivery destination codes didn't match any of Vane Medical's 7 Pacific Northwest distribution points, and when she cross-referenced them against the Federal Address Registry, 3 of them corresponded to vacant lots. She didn't sleep well the night she found the vacant lots. She lay in the dark, listening to Bess breathe through the baby monitor. She still kept on, even though Bess was 6 and didn't need monitoring anymore. She just liked the sound of her daughter breathing, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about her father pressing that lockbox into her hands. Keep them. She kept them. She was in the archive room at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night when the door opened and Alistair Vane walked in. He stopped when he saw her. He clearly had not expected to find anyone in the archive room at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night. Miss Calloway. His voice was neutral. Brenna had noticed that about him. He used neutrality the way other people used expressions, as a kind of controlled information management. Mr. Vane. She didn't move. She was sitting at the long table with the procurement logs spread in front of her in the specific order she'd developed over the past 3 weeks. Chronological within category. Flagged pages turned back at the corner, and she looked at him the way she looked at charts in the ER when an attending asked her to present, directly, without apology. He looked at the table, at the stacks of files, at the legal pad covered in her handwriting. He looked at her. What are you doing? Reading what someone should have read 2 years ago. Something moved in his face, not anger, something more like the specific discomfort of a man who doesn't know what he's looking at and doesn't like not knowing. You've been requesting records. Yes. Darlene flagged it. Of course she had, Brenna nodded. Is that a problem? He didn't answer immediately. He moved to the other side of the table and looked at the spread of documents without touching them. The careful assessment of someone who understood that arrangement conveyed information. He was reading her system. These are procurement logs, he said. Yes. You're a doctor. That's correct. She paused. My father built the procurement architecture for this company. I grew up listening to him explain it. She looked back at the page in front of her. I understand it better than most people in your building. The silence that followed was different from the 3 seats down silence of the boardroom. This one had weight. What did you find? He said. She looked at him. He had the same look he'd had when he interrupted the Q3 presenter, direct, slightly impatient, the look of a man who had already filtered out everything that wasn't the actual answer. She turned the legal pad toward him. He didn't say anything for a while. He read the way she'd come to recognize he read everything, completely, without performing attention, just giving it. He went through her notes twice. He asked her to show him the specific vendor code. She showed him. His jaw tightened in the way she would later learn it did when he was holding something in. VH Logistics, he said. It doesn't appear anywhere in the master vendor registry. It was added to the approved vendor list 18 months ago with Roderick's sign-off. She said it evenly. I'm not drawing conclusions. I'm telling you what the records show. Roderick Vane was Alistair's first cousin and the company's CFO. He was 41 years old, careful and particular, the kind of man who remembered everyone's coffee order and never raised his voice. In the 3 board meetings Brenna had attended, he'd been impeccably polite to her. He'd called her Miss Calloway and held doors and once offered to have his assistant compile a summary of the last 2 years' board minutes so she could get up to speed. She had declined. She'd already read them herself. Alistair set the legal pad down. He was very still in the way she was beginning to understand meant something was happening internally that he wasn't prepared to show. Do you have the delivery destination codes? He said. She handed him the page. He looked at the 3 addresses she'd highlighted. He looked at her. She recognized the moment. She'd seen it in trauma bays, the instant a physician understood something they hadn't wanted to understand, the fraction of a second between comprehension and response. The 3rd one, he said quietly. I know that address. Roderick owns property on that street. The archive room was silent. Outside the window, the Portland night was doing what Portland nights did, gray, damp, indifferent. I need 2 more weeks, Brenna said. I think there's a second structure underneath this one, a holding layer. She held his gaze. If you move before I have the full picture, he can clean it up. He stared at her. You've been sitting in this room for 3 weeks, and you didn't tell me. I didn't have enough to tell you anything. She didn't break eye contact. Suspicion isn't evidence. Something shifted in his expression, the specific recalibration of a man who has assigned someone to a category and is now discovering the category was wrong. He left without agreeing to anything, but he didn't tell her to stop. The thing about the product defect was that Brenna found it because she was a doctor, not because she was an accountant. She'd been reviewing the QA rejection logs, looking for anything else that might be falsified, when she noticed a cluster of rejections on a lot of surgical adhesive wound closures that had been overridden. The rejections cited a polymer inconsistency. The overrides were signed off by the quality director. The lot had shipped to 12 hospital systems across the Pacific Northwest 4 months ago. Brenna went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the archive room's thermostat. She pulled the rejection report. She pulled the clinical testing data. She read it 3 times because she was thorough and because the stakes of being wrong were not abstract to her. She'd used this product. She'd closed wounds with it. Her hands knew its texture. The polymer inconsistency could cause adhesion failure under tension. Adhesion failure in a wound closure meant dehiscence, reopened wounds, sepsis risk. She called Alistair at 7 in the morning. He answered on the 2nd ring. I found something, she said. It's not the money. It's worse than the money. They spent 14 hours at the table together. Not the archive room, his office, which had a whiteboard and a direct line to the company's outside product liability counsel and enough space to spread out the clinical data alongside the QA files. Brenna walked him through the medical implications with the same flat precision she used with attending physicians, without hedging, without softening the risk profile. He listened the way he'd listened to her notes, completely. How many units? He said. 11,240 shipped, roughly 40% likely already used, based on typical hospital drawdown rates. Timeline for voluntary recall? FDA notification within 24 hours, customer notification within 48, physical pull within 2 weeks. She paused. The longer we wait, the higher the liability, and the higher the risk to actual patients. He nodded once. He picked up the phone. She watched him initiate the recall. She watched him call the VP of Operations and the head of Regulatory Affairs, and she noticed that he didn't soften any of it, didn't bury the error in language, just stated it plainly. There is a product defect. We are issuing a voluntary recall. Here is what we need to do and when. She noticed that none of them pushed back. At 9:30, her phone rang. She stepped into the hallway to answer it. Mommy? Bess's voice was slightly croaky the way it got when she was overtired. Mrs. Page said you're working late. I am, baby. I'll be home by midnight, okay? You'll be asleep and I'll come kiss you. Can you kiss me now through the phone? Brenna pressed her lips to the phone and made the sound. Bess laughed, her real laugh, the one that sounded like something spilling over. I love you, Brenna said. Go to sleep. She hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment, with her hand still on the phone. When she went back in, Alistair was looking at her from across the room. Is your daughter okay? He said. She looked at him. She's fine. She just wanted to say goodnight. A pause. How old? 6. She moved back to the whiteboard, the regulatory timeline. Brenna. It was the first time he'd used her first name. It stopped her. He said it the way he said everything in his office, without preamble, the thought arriving already complete. I didn't know you were raising her alone. She looked at him. It didn't come up. No, he was quiet for a moment. It should have. She didn't know what to do with that. She turned back to the whiteboard, and they worked for another 4 hours, and she did not think about what it meant, except that some part of her, some deep and carefully fortified part, had noticed it and filed it away in a place she hadn't opened in a long time. Gemma came to her on a Thursday evening, stepping out from between 2 SUVs in the parking garage with a composure that suggested she'd practiced this. Miss Calloway. She had the tone of a woman who had spent years cultivating the specific register of polite indifference. I just want to make sure we understand each other. Whatever you're building in that archive room, whatever you think you're doing, you need to understand that Alistair has been with this company for 8 years. You have been here for 6 weeks. Brenna looked at her. She was not unaware that Gemma was beautiful, deliberately so, polished and intentional about it. She was also not unaware that Gemma's left hand was perfectly still at her side, not fidgeting, not betraying anything. The stillness was wrong. People who were genuinely just delivering a warning didn't stand that still. I appreciate the information, Brenna said, and got in her car. She sat in the parking garage for 10 minutes after Gemma's heels had clicked away, and she thought about that stillness. Then she went home and kissed Bess's forehead and opened her laptop and began tracing VH Logistics' ownership structure. She found the holding company at the 3rd layer. It took her until 4 in the morning. The holding company had 2 beneficial owners, Roderick Vane and a limited liability company registered in Delaware called Gemma Acquisitions Group. She sat with her laptop in the dark kitchen and she read the name twice. Then she closed the laptop and went to sit beside Bess for a while, listening to her breathe. She called Aldous Hartley at 7 in the morning. Aldous was 73 years old, the longest-serving member of the Vane Medical Board, and one of 3 people who had been in the room when Gil Calloway and Warren Vane signed the original partnership agreement. He had known Brenna since she was 9. He had sat at her father's funeral in the front row and cried with the specific unguarded grief of an old man who had run out of the energy required to hide it. Brenna, he said when she told him. His voice went very quiet. How complete is it? Complete enough. She looked at the documents spread across her kitchen table. Bess, still asleep down the hall, morning light coming through the blinds. Aldous, the annual shareholder meeting is in 8 days. If Roderick tables a motion to dissolve the partnership provision before I can present anything, he can't. Aldous's voice was careful, precise. Not if I invoke emergency agenda protocol. That requires 3 senior board members and it freezes the agenda for 48 hours. He paused. I know 2 others who will sign. But Brenna, once you walk into that room and put this in front of the board, there is no version of what follows that is quiet. I know. Is Alistair with you? She thought about 14 hours at the whiteboard, about the sound of her name in his mouth for the first time, about the way he'd looked at the legal pad in the archive room, not with suspicion, but with the focused intensity of a man who takes seriously what is put in front of him. He will be, she said. She told him everything that night, not in the archive room. In his office, after everyone else had gone home, with the city spread below the windows and the documents in a neat stack between them, she showed him the holding company. She showed him the Delaware registration. She turned to the last page and pointed at the second name. He read it. He didn't move for a long time. She let him be still with it. She'd learned by then that he processed things the way a clean system processes data, completely and without noise, and that the noise came from something underneath the processing, not from the processing itself. Gemma Acquisitions Group, he said. His voice was very flat. Registered 14 months ago, 3 months before she moved into your apartment. The city went on below the windows, a car horn somewhere, the specific hum of Portland at night, indifferent to the rooms above it. He stood up. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her. She let him stand there. She had access to everything, he said after a while. My calendar, my communications. He stopped. The records I pulled after our first night in the archive room, she would have seen them on my desk. Brenna said nothing. He knew what it meant. He was just hearing the full shape of it out loud for the first time. He turned around. His face had the expression she recognized now. Not anger, not grief, just absolute resolution. The face he got when a decision had already been made and the time for making it was over. What do you need me to do? He said. It was the first time he'd asked her that. The shareholder meeting was held on a Friday morning in October. Brenna walked in with Aldous on her left and Alistair on her right, and she felt the room register this the way rooms register things that don't match their expectations, with a collective, silent adjustment. Roderick was already seated. He looked at Brenna. He looked at Alistair. Something moved in his face and then settled back into its usual careful composure. Alistair spoke first. He addressed the board without notes, without hesitation. He laid out what Brenna had found, the procurement discrepancy, VH logistics, the holding structure, and he presented it the way he'd presented the product recall, plainly, without covering language, without protecting anyone. He said the company's CFO had systematically diverted funds over 18 months. He said the evidence had been compiled by his partner, Miss Brenna Calloway, using records and methods her father had put in place 20 years ago. He said partner, not the partnership condition, not a condition of anything. She felt something shift in her chest. Roderick tried to speak. He used words like premature and unverified, and the specific tone of a man who is very experienced at turning other people's reasonable concerns into procedural problems. Then Brenna stood up. She spoke for 12 minutes. She passed physical copies of the VH Logistics invoices, the Delaware registration, the holding company documentation with both names, Roderick Vane and Gemma Acquisitions Group, around the table. She was precise and unhurried, and she did not raise her voice once, because she had learned in 8 years of emergency medicine that the people in the room listen harder when you stay quiet. When she finished, she sat down. Roderick's composure did not hold all the way. It went the way things go when they've been held too long, not dramatically, not all at once, but in increments, the specific erosion of a structure that was never as solid as it appeared. He tried to dispute the Delaware registration. Aldous produced the certified copy. He tried to dispute the procurement timeline. She produced the vendor approval signatures in his own handwriting. He tried to say that Brenna was a grieving daughter with a personal agenda. Alistair said, without raising his voice, Miss Calloway is my partner. She built what you're looking at using my father's and her father's combined 30 years in this building. I'm asking this board to sit down and listen to what she found. The room was very quiet. The vote took 8 minutes, 10 in favor of suspending Roderick's authority pending independent investigation, 2 abstentions, 0 opposed. Roderick stood when the result was announced. He straightened his jacket with the precise habitual care of a man who had spent decades cultivating his surface. He walked to the door without looking back. Aldous leaned toward Brenna and said very quietly, Jill would have loved this. She pressed her hand over his for a moment. Then she looked at the table and breathed. Alistair found her in the hallway afterward. He was still wearing the expression she'd seen when he said partner, or something underneath that expression, something that had been developing over the past 3 weeks, in archive rooms and at whiteboards and across tables covered in documents that had slowly, without either of them deciding to let it happen, become a shared project. "I owe you an apology," he said. He didn't preamble it. "The day you walked into the boardroom, what I said." She looked at him. The partnership condition. Yes, he held her gaze. He didn't flinch from it. That's not what you were. That's not what you are. She thought about 3 seats down. She thought about the parking garage and the drive home and the 4 a.m. kitchen and Bess's breathing through the monitor. She thought about 12 minutes in front of a board of directors, presenting what her father had given her the tools to build, and the way it had felt when Alistair said her name without the condition attached. "It didn't hurt less because I understood it was business," she said. "I know," his voice was quiet. "I'm sorry anyway." She held his gaze for a long moment. She wasn't soft in the way that asked for something back. But she was honest, and honesty required acknowledging what was real. "Okay," she said. Something in his face shifted, not relief exactly, but something that had been held a long time releasing itself by a fraction of a degree. He looked almost like a man who didn't quite know what to do with something he'd been given. "Bess," he said, "does she like to read?" Brenna looked at him, slightly thrown by the pivot, obsessively, especially science. He nodded once and said nothing else. She picked Bess up from school the next afternoon. Alistair was in the car. She hadn't told Bess much of anything, because 6-year-olds ask clarifying questions that adults find difficult to answer, but Bess took one look at the man in the passenger seat and climbed in and said, with the directness that Brenna had apparently passed down genetically, "Who are you?" "My name is Alistair." He held up the book he'd been holding. It had a galaxy on the cover and the words "The Human Heart" in large letters on the spine. "Your mom mentioned you like science. I wasn't sure what you'd already read." Bess took the book. She opened it immediately, with the specific reverence she reserved for new books, running her finger down the table of contents. Then she looked up at Alistair. "Do you know how many times a human heart beats in a lifetime?" "I don't," he said. He sounded genuinely curious. 2.5 billion times, Bess said. "If you live to be 70. She paused. "My grandpa's heart only made it to 64 years. That's about 1.8 billion beats. Mom says that's still a lot of beats." Alistair glanced at Brenna. She was watching Bess, not him, but she felt the glance. "That is a lot of beats," he said. Bess looked at the book again. "I'm going to read this tonight," she announced. "Will you know if I have questions?" "I'll give your mom my number," he said. Bess accepted this with the equanimity of someone who had already moved on to evaluating the chapter on cardiac chambers. Brenna put the car in drive. She watched her daughter in the rearview mirror, the concentrated little frown of a child reading something interesting, and she felt something in her chest do something it hadn't done in a long time. Loosen, just slightly, the way a window feels when it finally gives after too many seasons stuck shut. She drove them home through the gray Portland afternoon, and the back seat was quiet, and something in the quality of that quiet was different from the quiet she'd been carrying alone for the past 2 years. It was the kind of quiet that had room in it. She let herself feel it for exactly the length of the drive, and then she parked, and Bess scrambled out with the book already tucked under her arm, and Brenna sat in the car alone for one more moment with her hands on the wheel. Then she got out and went inside, and this time she left the door open.